Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Midwest conference call. By popular demand, we have with us today the independent candidate for Senate in New York against Chuck Schumer, Diane Sare, who will be sort of introduced and prefaced with a presentation by Midwest's very own Stuart Battle. So with that, we'll just jump right into it and be ready for whatever questions you have at the end. We'll leave ample time for discussion. Okay, let's go.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Hi, everybody. So I'm Stuart Battle, and I'm just going to say a few words before I turn it over to Diane tonight. And I think we find ourselves at quite a dramatic moment in history. Maybe that's a very large understatement, but certainly is the case. As Diane will speak about, and as people have probably gotten a certain inkling of, inflation is exploding. We've been doing nonstop bailouts of virtually every major bank and other largely bankrupt corporation for at least 12 to 13 years now, which only got worse with COVID. We've been increasingly getting into intensified dangers of war, even so much so that there was a Pentagon insider who had been so terrified of the threat of a war with China over Taiwan. We've been sending destroyers and various military ships through the Taiwan Straits, which is what separates China and Taiwan, for a number of months now. So this Pentagon insider got so irked and terrified by the reality of the situation and how little was being said that he went to as many news agencies as he could to spread this reality. Nobody would accept him, so he finally went to China's Global Times, which is their government-run newspaper, and wrote an op-ed in the Chinese newspaper as a sitting Pentagon employee on the danger of war with China. If that gives you a sense of, what else the media isn't telling you about. And then on top of that, we're on the verge of committing economic suicide, not just here, but around the world with this Green New Deal and Great Reset policy. And actually, to quote another Chinese journalist, I believe he was a professor also, who said it very precisely in the last few days, in response to what the G7, the group of 7 nations, just had their meeting over the last several days in Great Britain. In response to their meeting, what this Chinese journalist said was, "Far from confronting China, these Western leaders are only in confrontation with reality and with the interest of the American people and the people of the world at large," which I think is quite a relevant way to put the failures of our current political leadership. Is we're in confrontation with reality and with the interest of the people of our country and the world. So in light of this, there was a very interesting event today, which interestingly enough came from the US President Joe Biden meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And what was interesting about this is that it was not what you would have expected. Everybody who's on here probably might have had expectations of what to expect with such a meeting. And happily, there was not the expected outcome. The quote from the one of the major quotes from the communique that followed was an echo of a 1985 meeting between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland as well. That, let me just read it here. They said, nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And there was a number of other things that made very clear the intent to walk back from a red line, to walk back from a very dangerous escalating situation between the US and Russia, to have an increased dialogue between our two countries. When Putin was asked about how the event went during his press conference, he said, well, I'm going to quote Leo Tolstoy, that there is no such thing as true happiness. There's only glimpses of happiness. And I think today we saw glimpses of confidence, which is very interesting. So that's to say, to be a little more specific, this is not to say that Joe Biden pulled out a secret, trick out of his hat and is really a, kind of a white horse, peacenik or profound thinker. That's not at all the case. The situation is that the LaRouche Organization has been mobilizing for a number of months to prevent and stop the escalating danger of nuclear war, especially between the United States and Russia and the United States and China. There have been other leading voices, not all of whom are, necessarily perfect people, but kind of like this Pentagon insider who decided to speak out, realized that the consequences for not doing so are really serious. And so things have been set in motion that are actually very good from the standpoint of what we need to accomplish on a scale politically around the world to actually put in place a durable survival for the human species. One point that I'll make of relevance is that on April 13th, there was 4 things that took place of interest. One of which was that the Russians deployed military forces, significant military forces to the border of Ukraine. Then the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, announced publicly that was the case, that the Russians were deploying to the Ukrainian border. Then the foreign minister, deputy foreign minister Ryabkov of Russia, warned the United States that its planned deployment of 2 destroyers into the Black Sea was, quote unquote, playing with fire, which caused the United States military to back down and leave the Black Sea. And then lastly, what happened that day is Joe Biden called up Vladimir Putin and began the process of what culminated in today's meeting. So what I'm saying and what I think is safe to conclude is that Joe Biden, or maybe others who were putting the phone in his hands, were peeing their pants because of how dangerous the situation has become. And so we're now looking at a situation where there is a response to reality, and there's a response in a certain, well, before I say that, so what we're trying to do here, and the reason we're having this discussion, is that Lyndon LaRouche forecast over 50 years ago now that the transatlantic financial system would not exist for much longer without fundamental reforms that would be in the interest of sovereign nation states and the takedown of the British Empire. Now, a lot's happened in those 50 years, not too many of which were in the direction of what would be required for a productive, functional economic system and reorganizing the global financial system. And thus we find ourselves, like the Chinese journalist made the point, in contradiction to reality. The question is, when do we enter a moment when reality becomes so unignorable or offensively obvious that it can no longer be ignored? And that's exactly what we intend to assist in creating. We now have enormous momentum against the Green New Deal policy. There's quite a large amount that's happening in the United States, including in the Plain States. Nebraska is spearheading a very large effort against this 30 by 30 attempt to steal tremendous amounts. They want to take 30% of US land out of productive use by 2030. And there's tremendous activity against that. Switzerland also just had a referendum against a couple of the anti-carbon initiatives in Switzerland this last weekend, which were voted down, causing quite tremendous panic around the European Union and the world. And there is an increasing resistance to this confrontation policy, to this war policy, which has been coming from the neoliberal British crowd, including from a number of the European countries at the G7 this last several days, who are really not too excited about coming up with a new strategic policy to surround and confront China, when that's becoming their biggest market and trading partner, and it's going to be completely destructive to those ends. So you've got a real multiple domains of failure of the narrative. And so from that standpoint, I'm going to hand it over to Diane, and I will just pose the question: how do we as the United States, and how do we as the world and citizens ourselves, how do we get in tandem with the true interests of the American people and the world at large? And I think that is the question which we hope to advance. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Diane.
Okay, thanks. Well, first, I'd like to say I'm glad to be in the Midwest by Zoom. And also, I would urge everybody here to take personal responsibility to get anywhere from 300 to 300 people on to the conference of the Schiller Institute, June 26th and 27th. I think this summit presents a great potential, but they really want to sabotage it. And you saw, I was actually struck, the CNN journalists questioning Biden were just about as rabid as they were when they used to harass Trump. And their line of questioning was really stupid and disgusting. But didn't you challenge Putin on his human rights violations? Well, what about Navalny? What about this? You said you guarantee, and Biden said, I didn't say I guaranteed anything. He didn't, of course, say that, there's no evidence for these crimes. But, and I certainly have a number of hypotheses as to why this meeting occurred. I think it had a great deal to do, as Stuart was alluding to, with some of the things that Putin and Russia have done, not the least of which is developing hypersonic missiles. I mean, there are certain things that President Putin said absolutely would not be tolerated, like ethnic cleansing in the eastern part of Ukraine, where you have 250,000 people with Russian passports. And we know what these Nazis did in Odessa, where they herded Russian people into the labor union building, boarded it up and set them on fire and burned them alive. So, there are just certain things after losing 27 million people in World War II that Russia is not prepared to countenance. Oh, good, Stuart, thanks. So he just put the link there so everyone can register. You should register, and then you should share when you RSVP, you get a confirmation back with a link which identifies you so that someone can actually determine who came because of your invitation. So, or at least who registered because of your invitation. It's really important. We need a total breakout at this conference. And you'll see why. A lot of what I'm going to go through may not be new for everyone here, but I think it's worth thinking through again and again and again, because our society is so geared toward viewing money as something that has meaning or importance or intrinsic worth, and it has none. So what I wanted to do is start with a quote from one of, I don't know, every paper I read at the moment I read it is one of my favorite papers by Lynn, but this is one of my favorite papers by Lynn. Just the opening here, which I'm going to share with you. Yeah, so this is from his paper, April 28th, 1999, the Economics IQ Test. If anyone tells you that a rising Dow Jones stock market index proves that the US economy is growing, your reply ought to be, oh, you mean that the cancer is growing? Tell me, doctor, how is the patient doing? And then he goes on, given the present circumstances of most of today's world, that is not a cruel thing to say. It is something which any intelligent and honest person would consider it necessary to say under the rapidly worsening real economic conditions in the USA today. As a report included in this EIR special feature summarizes the fact, quote, during the coming 6 months, more US citizens, especially the poor and the elderly, will die of the worsening economic sicknesses caused by current Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan and related Wall Street Journal policies than of illnesses such as heart disease and cancer. Indeed, many of the preventable deaths from heart disease and cancer are the result of those financial and related budgetary policies. And I would say that the 600,000 COVID deaths in the United States are for the same reason as are the 3 million plus worldwide. That is, the reason why a virus becomes a pandemic is because of the policies. I also thought this was a little eerie because I don't know if you remember a few years ago, I think it was a Princeton think tank released a study on the number of people who had died what they called deaths of despair, and they took non-Hispanic Caucasian men, that was one category, who died. It was between the years of 1998 and 2014, I think, something like that, exactly around the time when LaRouche made this forecast, and it was 500,000 deaths more than had occurred before of diseases directly related to economic stress, whether it was drug overdose, suicide, alcoholism, that kind of thing. So LaRouche wasn't kidding. He was right on the mark. And many people claim that he was exaggerating, the crash never hit. Well, that's because of the fiction of the stock market as being a measure of the collapse. So I'm going to go now to the triple curve function because we have to, I think it's really important to bear this in mind. Oops. Oh, am I sharing now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. So here it is. There's Lynn. And here is the curve. Now, it's really important to understand when he says a triple curve function, he means one function. It's not 3 functions, it's one function, and the time is going, you see the horizontal line, time is going from left to right. At the beginning of this curve on the left side, you see the red, the green, and the gold lines are together. And that is because until the 60s, or at least for a while, the money that was issued, whether as loans, the holdings on the stock market, bonds, stocks in various productive enterprises, companies, steel companies, airlines, and so on, and our output were actually the same thing. They were related. They were one curve. What happened actually was LaRouche's first economic forecast was in the late 50s. And he was working, I'm not sure if he was actually doing consulting for General Motors or observing it, but what he observed is that the company, General Motors, was revealing that most of their profit came not from the sale of cars, but from financing. That they discovered they could give an auto loan, like everyone knows the used car dealerships, right? Come on in, you don't need credit, blah, blah. So what are they doing? They're giving you a loan with often usurious interest rates, and they're making their money on the loan, and you may still be holding that debt well beyond the life of the car. So it was at this point that LaRouche warned the end of the Bretton Woods system and the onset of the post-industrial economy, and that it would be a complete disaster, because once you no longer have the physical object, what is the money paying for? But he said this is really late 60s. I think, it took a while for all that to develop. And in 1971, Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve system. And to be very clear, it wasn't that people could run in and cash their dollars for gold. It was the margin for settling international accounts, but it was a way of stabilizing currencies so that you had fixed exchange rates, so that nations which borrowed money would owe the same amount. If they borrowed money when the peso was 6 to the dollar, and they were repaying it over 20 years, they could be confident 20 years later, the peso would still be worth 6 to the dollar. So they were just paying interest, as opposed to once there was no standard exchange rate, you could get a loan when the peso was 6 to the dollar and then repay it when the peso was 6,000 to the dollar. And you would get to pay 1,000 times more than you borrowed plus interest, which is what the International Monetary Fund and World Bank did. So what happened is that suddenly you had more financial aggregates. They went up first, see the red line there, the stock market, because you began divorcing it from the reality of physical production, like as particularly with derivatives and things like that, where you can take a bet on whether a company is going to go up and down. And if you bet the right way, suppose you bet that the company goes bankrupt, you make money even though the company goes bankrupt. So you have a situation where the stock market became more and more literally an inverse proportion to your physical economy, what you were investing in plant and equipment, in infrastructure, and things that allow you to be productive. And in 2008 in particular, which is one inflection point where you could say that little circle is where the green line surpasses the red, where they decide to just start issuing money supply to try and keep up with the financial instruments, you go into kind of a hyperbolic shock, or a shock front, where in a sense the cone, if you imagine this as a cone and not just a flat chart, almost gets inverted, and the whole thing just completely breaks down. So we are now, this is overripe, because what occurred in 2008 is not that we reorganized anything. No one said, oh my gosh, LaRouche was right. These banks are much too big. We really need Glass-Steagall. We need to put them through bankruptcy. Let's write off this crap and let's get back into production again and bring our curves back together in one function. No, they didn't say that. They said, oh, it's just a mortgage crisis. This was not systemic. And then, as people know, Paulson came screaming into the Congress. People remember in 2008, the Congress voted, I think, twice against the bailout, and they were getting calls from people all over the country. One congressman from Pennsylvania said, I'm getting 2,000 calls and emails per day, and half of them are no, and the other half are hell no. So there was overwhelming opposition to doing this bailout. So Paulson came in and threatened blood in the streets, martial law, you have to do this. And the first 700 billion was issued. And then 700 billion again, and then again and again. It's over, I don't know, I've really sort of lost track, maybe 23 trillion or more. I think this guy's name Barofsky or something, who actually was looking into how much all of this was. Now the Federal Reserve is issuing $120 billion a month. You might remember this began in 2019 when there was a huge, I can't imagine why, there was a terrible collapse of confidence in the banking system, and they didn't want to do their overnight lending at the discounted rate. So the interest rate shot up, I forget what, to like 6% or 11% or something, which would be really expensive if you're borrowing lots of money back and forth overnight. So the Federal Reserve stepped in with 75 billion in overnight loans. And then they said, well, instead of overnight, it'll be 3 days, it'll be a week or whatever. Now we're doing 120 billion a month, and they're saying basically it's unlimited. And the thing that really cracks me up is they're saying, well, we're just having temporary hyperinflation. There's no plan to end this. So the Federal Reserve, as Paul reported in my symposium last Friday, Paul Gallagher, now is holding $8 trillion worth of crap, of things that they've bought, that they've been pumping money into. This is up from 800 billion in 2008. So the Federal Reserve has increased what they're holding tenfold in 12 years, 10 times. Last year, what the Federal Reserve was holding was $4 trillion. So if you keep in mind that hyperbolic curve function, you see that right there. Has this caused hyperinflation? Well, let's see. The price of food is on average up 39%. Apparently the price of corn or maize is up 89%. Imagine what that means in places like Mexico, which depend largely on maize. Lumber is up 250%. Anyone trying to build a shed or a house or fix your porch, or forget it. And all kinds of things. Steel is in short supply. And you also have games going on. I'm extremely suspicious of some of these so-called hacking operations, the ransomware things, which happen with Colonial Pipeline and JBS, the beef and pork processor. Because if you think about Enron, that model and what they do, they say, well, we're going to make supply scarce so we can jack up the price. And as Paul pointed out, when the Colonial Pipeline hack occurred, they didn't actually damage any of the transshipment of the oil. It was only in the financial and records part that was hacked. So physically, they could have continued to move the oil, but they didn't. And so you really have to ask, I think, questions about this. And if you think about what happened in Texas during that cold snap back in March, now they really did have Mother Nature intervened and said that thou shalt not build windmills and solar panels. And the grid froze, but what did they do? Griddies increased people's bills from $100 a month to $9,000 a month. So this kind of mentality, and this is what I'm saying, playing with money. And it's really going to become worthless. So, and that is something I think you really have to think through. People, and also people who say they have, well, I'm not worried about money, I have gold. Well, okay, can you eat your gold? I mean, what are you going to buy with the gold if there's no food? And, or they're, you know, I've met plenty of them lately, people, the preppers, right? So they got all this food stored away somewhere. People should really consider what it means to exist as a human being in society, because maybe you can live a couple weeks on your canned whatever, macaroni and cheese or whatever you have in your basement, freeze dried tomatoes or God knows what. But then what? I mean, what is the meaning of your life? What's the immortality of mankind? So this is something either we solve as a whole or we're dead, and your money or your gold is not going to help you. And the irony is there is no thing that will, because what we have to develop, what we have to ensure continues is an actual dynamic. It's a process of development, which is the thing that we can hang our hat on. It's like being in an airplane. The thing that keeps you in the air is the air that's moving by. If the air stopped moving, then the plane would crash. So it's not any particular thing that you can hold on to. It's this dynamic of development, the keys, as LaRouche has said, energy, flux density, and which generates your ability to increase your potential relative population density. So then what happened in COVID? And some of you may remember the Chinese had actually a very pointed editorial because they said, you know, we didn't send people checks and print tons of money in COVID. China, they said, we were more interested in feeding the roots. So they gave a lot of tax breaks, right? If people were unemployed or their businesses were shut down, maybe they couldn't pay taxes. So they did things to ease the conditions of people. And as people know, if you watched any of those CGTN videos, which I thought were so amazing at the beginning when they had the lockdown and they had, and Chinese food is so good. You would see the food they were delivering to people's houses and so on. I could see why someone said, if you have COVID, you really want to be in Wuhan and have delicious hot Chinese meals delivered to your door and so on. But at any rate, so they invested in the physical economy. They declared war on the disease. They did not think it was acceptable to, oh, we'll just have a few elderly and people with comorbidities die. And the more important thing is to keep that money flowing. That wasn't their approach, right? So they recovered fairly quickly. What did we do here? We sent checks all over the place for people to do nothing. But worse than that, and that is bad, we printed trillions and trillions of dollars. That was what increased this Federal Reserve balance sheet by so much. So, you know, if you think about where this inflation is coming from, we printed trillions of dollars and it went to the banks. And anyone who runs a business may know that the banks were not lending the money. One of the things they got really angry at Trump for, which he was right to do, was the Treasury took back a bunch of the money that they had put in circulation because the banks weren't lending it out. And we found that, you know, various entities, if you went to Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Bank of America, any of the major banks and tried to get one of these PPP loans, forget it. They were not giving the loans to the small businesses. You had to go to a little local, whatever, some kind of local bank that only existed in your state, and you could get a loan. So the big banks are now holding twice as much in deposits as they are lending out. So anyone who ever studied Alexander Hamilton, the whole question of credit, or Friedrich List, who apparently is the most popular foreign economist in China, an American system economist, this is the exact opposite of what you do if you want the economy to grow. Now, if you get back, so you go back to our triple curve with that curve that goes down for production. One thing I was just looking at for the state of New York, it's just worth thinking about, and I'm sure this is similar all over the country. The state of New York lost 2,100 family farms from 2012 to 2019. 4% of the farmland in the state was taken out of production. And you had things like this all over. Oh, I think I found some more charts. I'm gonna go back here and just show you. Let's see here. Yeah, look at this. And this is not even up to now. This is just from 1996 to 2002. But you look at this bottom line here, manufacturing employment going down, corporate profits, which I guess they weren't playing the market enough, having a collapse, but I guess from production, the amount of debt, personal and corporate debt going up, and the money supply going up even more. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, here's another one. This is just, what is this? I can't read the top of that chart.
It's the money supply. And
oh yeah, money supply. Okay, right. So you see this also really going out of control, making money worthless. And it's worth thinking, you know, what happened to the people in Weimar, Germany in 1923, where the preconditions for World War II were really created from World War I, because what they imposed on Germany is they literally took all of their rail cars, all of their livestock, everything that was productive out of the country. And then they said, and now you're going to pay reparations. So all they could do was print money, and the money became worthless. And at a certain point, the price of things would change while you were in the store. So if you went in, and people would get paid 2 or 3 times a day because the money would be worth less by the end of the day. So you'd get paid at lunch, and you'd take like paper bags of money and rush to the store to buy. And you didn't even care what you bought, because whatever you could buy would be worth more than the money you were spending on it. And then you'd come back with your wheel, and if you look at these old pictures, you see pictures of people with like giant carts filled with 100 million Reichsmarks notes that they're rushing off to buy, you know, 3 slices of bread and something else. And finally, of course, the whole thing collapsed. One of our supporters once showed us a letter, because I think he had left the country, and he had something like 30,000 Reichsmarks in his bank account. And he finally, after 23, he got a letter from the bank saying, you know, this 30,000 Reichsmarks was worth so little that we just closed your account. Don't come back. It would be like, you know, you have a few $100,000 in the bank today, and the dollar becomes totally worthless. And you get a letter from the bank saying, well, that $300,000 you thought you had is worth the equivalent of 1/3 of a penny. And it wasn't worth it to us to keep your account open. I mean, that is what happened to people. So it's really important to consider how urgent it is that we do what LaRouche said, we put the system through bankruptcy. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things, because I made the point in my note that spreading syphilis is not going to help with this. And I was referring to the legalization of prostitution, where it's been decided in Manhattan that, I mean, you know, if you're going to legalize pot and you're going to move mentally ill, homeless people and former prisoners into major hotels in the middle of the city, and you're going to have people doing everything under the sun on the public sidewalk, then you can't put people in jail for smoking a joint. You're not going to prosecute them for prostitution. In some places, I forget where in Europe, they actually made revenue from prostitution and drugs part of their GDP. They count that as part of their income. Now, I want to try and kind of lead you to think this through. Think about having a beautiful, modern, magnetically, a rail car that's designed for a maglev rail, but you don't have electricity and you don't have the rail. Now, so you may have this beautiful modern rail car, but the power of that car, your ability to use it, does not exist because you don't have the platform that goes with it. It's just like if you have a plumber, like suppose someone who uses, I don't know, a roto-rooter or whatever, you have a plumber in the United States who comes to clean out your drain with all of this equipment. It has one thing. Now, suppose you send that same plumber to the maquiladoras in Mexico, if they still have those slave labor conditions with open sewers and there are no sewage, or you send them to India where there's, what's the plumber going to do with these tools? The plumber has no power because the entire platform on which this plumber is trying to operate does not exist. And this is why Lyndon LaRouche said that we want to talk about, instead of just saying infrastructure, like a particular project, this or that, he said a platform, that your power to transform nature, to have power to change the universe, depends on the entire society. That's why what Franklin Roosevelt did with the Rural Electrification Administration was so completely revolutionary, and Wall Street opposed it 100%. They said it is so uneconomical to have 40 miles of copper wire to reach one farmhouse. I mean, okay, you can electrify the city, everyone's close together, that won't be that expensive. And what FDR understood is by electrifying the entire nation, changing the planet, what does electricity mean on a farm? Besides that, you know, you don't have to spend all day washing your clothes or something, or that you can have refrigeration, that you can have light, that you can actually increase the frequency with which the hens lay eggs. In other words, you're in a completely different domain. And that's what I mean by process, what I was saying earlier. It's not any particular thing that you can hang on to that's going to save you in this economic collapse, but it's the dynamic of continuously improving your platform, your level of technology, your standard of living. Now, so let's go back and talk about what my friend Senator Schumer is doing with his marijuana. He calls it the Freedom and Opportunity Act. I mean, talk about newspeak. It's, if you think about the opium wars that the British ran against China, which enslaved everyone, it's really the Slavery and Death Act. What is it going to do to our population? I mean, even supposing you can make a lot of quote unquote money with this drug trade, what is going to be the damage to your society in terms of people having psychotic episodes, because the THC level is like 99%. It's much, much higher than it was in the 60s. Colorado had a 30% increase of children going to the emergency room, for example. Denver had a 50% increase in violent crime. What does this mean for any standard of so-called law enforcement? I mean, if you have no bottom and everything is legal and people can have psychotic episodes on the sidewalk, what, you know, what can you arrest someone for? Everything just goes insane. So you're getting money, but the actual money you're getting is much less than the cost to your society because you're destroying your platform. I've talked to people in some of the building trades unions who tell me that already not only are they not able to find new workers because of the drug problems, but there are very serious accidents on these construction sites because people are operating under the influence. So you have construction workers dying. You have heavy things being dropped off big heights and being broken and destroyed. You just have, that's what they're talking about. And so we used to have a polemic about, or, you know, is $10 from a pimp or $10 from a guy working at Boeing, an operating engineer or something, the same amount of money? Or if you're an auto mechanic and you're changing the oil in someone's car, and the pimp pays you $80 for the oil change, and the operating engineer who's working at a nuclear power plant gives you $80 for the oil change, is that $80 equal? Is it all the same? And I think that's something that we really have to think about. So I think I'm going to stop, because we should just have a discussion, and there's more that I can say about how you solve this, which is the only solution. Maybe I'll just say it now because I want to make sure. The only solution is to put the whole damn thing through bankruptcy. There is nothing else. You just have to wipe it out. You have to, and that's part of Glass-Steagall coming in, but bankruptcy reorganization, you're going to have to go through the books of every bank, and you're going to have to wipe out the debt that's related to the speculative garbage, and you're going to have to salvage the weak little sprouts of things that are real. And the reason why you need Glass-Steagall is you have to separate, you have to protect the things that are real with a firewall so they can't be gambled away. And you don't have to protect or guarantee the gambling, but then you're going to urgently have to have a national bank and a way to direct credit, because doing this is going to crash the stock market. It is going to, you know, wipe out a lot of what people think they have in their pension funds. My point is their pension funds are going to be like the 10 wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks. They're not going to be worth anything. So you're going to wipe these things out, but then you need credit to keep the real economy functioning, the local sewage treatment plant, the first responders, the hospital, this, that, those things have to be paid. And what people will discover is their standard of living is actually much higher, because the purchasing power of the dollar, a dollar backed up in that way, will be 10 or 20 times greater than what the purchasing power of the dollar is now. So people will have security. And it's, frankly, it's very hard to imagine. It's very hard to imagine right now a time where one person working 40 hours a week had enough money to support a family of 4, 5, or 6 people, that they paid their rent or their mortgage with 1 week's pay, and that they had money to put aside for savings, and they could pay their kids tuition because it didn't cost $1 million to become an idiot at a university. And you know, and you had decent health coverage because the insurance companies were not HMOs, which were designed to make a profit by killing you, because obviously it's less expensive if you kill the patients than if you try to keep them alive. You know, so basically what I'm saying is everything has to be changed, but necessity is the mother of invention. And as we saw in Europe with this referendum in Switzerland that Stuart was talking about at the beginning, against the Green New Deal, I think this can be done because it has to be done. We have a precedent in what the kind of measures that Franklin Roosevelt took, which even occurred within the lifetime of some people who are still alive today. And we've just got to get the word out to everybody on what the solution is. And we have the great advantage today that China, which has a very huge economy, did not go insane. I mean, if the markets crash in China, since they spent the last 10 years building, I don't know what, 37,000 miles, 52,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, their investment is in actually physical, real things. It's not like what we have here. It's different. So you have something to show for the amount of money in circulation. We don't have that. And that's the difference, but that's also strength, so that if we were to collaborate with them, then you have a way, we don't have to like dig through the mud and crawl to get to the level that's needed. We can leap over a lot of backwardness. Anyway, so that's what I have, but I think we should discuss it.